Hello and welcome everyone. Welcome to today's session where we're going to talk a little bit about CPTED standardization, which is a very hot topic right now with the ICA standards coming out, and also some work about the Standardization Committee that the guest that has joined me today, Paul van Soomeren, who's the Regional Director for Europe, will help me unpack and talk a little bit about through some of the frequently asked questions and some of the questions that I think our practitioners might find very useful. So welcome, Paul, and thank you so much for joining me.
Hi, good to see you. It's a pleasure to be here. Yeah, and explain everything about standardization. Everything you always wanted to know about standardization. Yeah.
Exactly. It's like, yeah, all questions answered. Excellent. Well, you're such an expert, Paul, that I have no doubt that you're going to address everything very clearly. So, okay, so shall we jump straight in and just maybe start with why standardization? What's the point of standardization in general?
Yeah, I think the easiest answer is all about communication and consensus. So when you're working on, for example, a product, and two stakeholders are doing that, let's say a car manufacturer, one is making the car and the other one is making the door, you need a kind of consensus about the door and the car, that it should fit. That's standardization. So making together, sitting around the table and making a text, which is called a standard, which explains all about a product or a service or a process, I'll come to that later, that's standardization. It's that simple. It is a consensus text. That's everything.
So very nice and concise, yeah, in a nutshell, yeah. But so, and when we talk about CPTED and CPTED community, is standardization useful for the field of CPTED? Why do we actually need it for CPTED?
Yeah, worldwide, there are thousands, 10,000 of standards. This far, there were not that many standards for CPTED. At the same time, we already noticed for years that everyone is using different terminology, different approaches, etc., etc. I think that's good. That's perfect. So you should approach CPTED in a local fashion. It is something which you have to solve locally. But when we talk to each other on a national basis, it comes in very handy to have a standard about simple questions. What is CPTED? What use do we? What name do we use? For example, in my country, we don't use the name CPTED very much. People don't simply know what it is. We say something like veilig ontwerp en beheer. So then it is important to explain in a standard that CPTED is the same as veilig ontwerp en beheer. So that goes for every country. But one level higher, you have the same problem in Europe. You have all these languages in Europe, all these approaches, different approaches. So already in 1995, 96, people started to talk about CPTED and working on a standard, which ended up in a European standard in 2003 in the end. And that standard explains what CPTED is, what approaches there are. For example, a very simple thing, first and second generation CPTED. There's a physical side to CPTED, but also a social side to CPTED. That is, for some people, spectacular news. It is good to write that down in a text and to put it in a standard. That's what we did in Europe in 2003, and later on we still work on these standards. Later on, that became also an ISO standard, which is a worldwide standard. Well, you can imagine that you have the problem of consensus on a worldwide basis. That's even more difficult. So that's why standardization in general is important, and also for CPTED it is important. And maybe I just made the distinction between a product like a car, but also services, and you can think about a training. What training do we deliver as a university? So you can compare your training with other trainings in the country, in Europe, worldwide, and you have standards for processes. A very well-known standard for a process is that one on quality management, the ISO 9000 series. And you have a lot of companies saying, we are certified ISO 9000. So we use a specific way of controlling our quality, on managing our quality in this firm. And that's ISO is a worldwide standard. So that's it about standardization in general, I guess, and a bit about.
Perfect. Yeah, we actually provided a good overview. Thank you, Paul. And we're going to touch some of those things later on as well. And you're going to talk more about the European standard and the ICO standard, how it came about, and so on. So, and you mentioned that when we talk about standardization and standardization of CPTED, we talk about standardization of a product, service, or process. So how can actually like a CPTED practitioner or someone, who's maybe bound or who could use a standard, because I think that's also an important distinction, right? It's not actually, sometimes it's legally binding, sometimes not. So maybe actually we can touch upon that and then also address how to actually use a standard.
Yeah, standardization is always voluntary. So if you want to talk to other people and find consensus about a product, a service or a process, then you sit around the table and you say, okay, what is this product? What is this service? What is this process all about? We write it down, and that is the standard text. So we already had standardization in the ICA, the International CPTED Association, for years actually. So a good example of a standard for training is the certified training we are having at the ICA. You have the program ICCP, it's called. It's on the website, and that is a standard issued by the ICA for a specific type of training. Then you can see, well, okay, if I follow this training, this is in it, and this is what it's all up to, and other people can see that too. So that's an example of a private organization, you might say, the ICA, making a standard for a specific type of training. But what we did with the standardization I talked about a minute ago in Europe was make a standard on the question, what is CPTED? It is first generation, second generation, that type of information. Just also to explain that to architects, to urban planners, to youth workers or school people, whatever, also to universities. What is CPTED and how do you practice it? What method do we normally use, do we normally include as a kind of a minimum for CPTED? That's the process type of thing we put in that European standard, which is also in the worldwide ISO standard, by the way. It is, for example, simple requirements like, okay, you should involve all relevant stakeholders. So, for example, if you practice CPTED in a residential neighborhood, the residents must be involved somehow. That it's so logical and so simple, but it's not always done. You should follow a kind of sequence. Analyze the problem first, together with all relevant stakeholders. Set your goals together. Do the separate work and evaluate what's coming out. That's another part of that European standard. And you can imagine, I remember that there were such very simple things when you try to find a consensus between different countries. That is really difficult because, just to give you an example, in France you have these enormous suburbs with high-rise buildings, the banlieues. And if you say, okay, the minimum requirement in this standard is that you should involve all residents in a neighborhood, that it might be easy in a middle class neighborhood somewhere around Amsterdam, but it's awfully difficult in a multicultural environment like the banlieue in Paris. So then you have enormous discussion. Okay, should we include this in this standard or not? In the end, you have a kind of consensus, and then you can say, okay, we have European or worldwide or whatever continent or city or nation you're talking about. We have that consensus about this is accepted and this is how we do it. And the good thing about these standards is that it is issued on a worldwide basis. Even European standard, you only need a number for it. You go to your national standardization institute and you can buy a standard. It's awfully expensive, but well, okay, that's not a problem.
Yeah, well, there's a lot of knowledge, a lot of work that goes in there. So, it's a kind of labor of love and effort and experience. So it needs to have some kind of price, I guess, from that perspective. Yeah. Again, we're gonna talk a little bit about SAN and ICO standards in a while. But you already touched upon a little bit about who is SAP standardization for. Could we maybe unpack that a little bit? So who are the users? Who's the audience? Who should buy it?
Yeah, I would say it is since we are working with in SAPTED with architects, urban planners, police people, law enforcement, or whatever the name is, community people, and in specific situations, it is schools and youth workers, etc. So standardization is for this type of people. When you on a local or national basis, you sit around the table and you say, okay, we want to prevent crime. Using SAPTED, using environmental design, then all these people can simply say, okay, let's first read this standard, and let's then discuss, are we agree with it, and then we use this standard. So it is a voluntary type of approach to if you want to follow it. But as soon as you have said together, okay, let's, the name for it is compliance, we comply with standard, then it becomes in that group, for that moment, for that project, it becomes in a way compulsory because, well, you as a group together, you have stated, okay, we follow this standard. This is how we do it. This is what we define as SAPTED.
Mm-hmm.
You might also say, okay, we only use chapter 1, or we only use chapter 2, or we make our own chapter 3 in the standard. But it is helpful in communicating what SAPTED is and how you do it, how the process works, and you can comply with it. So, and you can do that on every level, local, national, continental, like the European standards we made, but now also on a worldwide basis.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think and we talk about voluntary compliance often, right, with these things, and then kind of once you agree on terms and conditions, then you obviously need to ensure that the whole team follows it. So that, to me, it completely makes sense. But something that you also touched upon was that the importance of having multiple actors, multiple players at the table, and the stakeholders, whichever we want to call them. But let's say someone gets the standard in their hands and they want to, apply SEPTED. Would you say that that's sufficient? Can the standard replace SEPTED expertise, or is it having someone who's actually knowledgeable and experienced in SEPTED, who's potentially also certified through the ICA, like you mentioned earlier? Does the standard replace that SEPTED expertise or the need for that expertise?
No. It can never replace a good process of a group of people working on crime prevention through environmental design. It is only a kind of a tool for helping the communication and to make that simpler. To give you an example, 20 years ago, before there was any standardization, we could talk only in a city where I live, in Amsterdam, days after day about, okay, what is SEPTED then? How do we define it? Now we can simply say, okay, here you have that standard, read it, and then do we all agree that this is SEPTED? Well, that's it. And if you want to make an amendment, okay, that's clear too. But you can use it in communication, and the same goes for, okay, do we follow these steps in our process of implementing SEPTED in this town, or in this nation, or in this continent? Okay, yes, if we use it, we can use it. So it is a helpful tool for helping communication and come to a quicker consensus about what SEPTED is, how you do it, etc.
Mm-hmm. And it also gives it some more legitimacy, right? I mean, if it's a standard, if it's in that document, then people actually accept it as a real legitimate approach as well.
Yeah, it is. It is. Yeah, it has. You can say it has more status. And what happens from time to time, and that's interesting, that the local or national or international government says, okay, let's use this standard, and then you only have a number there, but you can check it with ISA or SEN or your own national standardization body. Let's use this standard. So then, in a way, suddenly it can become more obligatory by national or international laws. So in a country like France, they can, for example, say, okay, you have this SEN 14383 standard of SEN. We make it. We refer to that standard in a law. So then you can make a law on on SEPTED, you might say. An example of a product, we have products like good locks on the door and good light and all that to prevent burglary. And that's a national standard in the Netherlands. NEN, Normalization Institute of the Netherlands, issued that standard, and at a certain moment, the law, the building laws say you have to use this standard to make burglary-resistant dwellings, for example. And at that moment, it suddenly becomes obligatory. The same goes for ISO 9000 quality management. I'm completely free to use it, in my company. But as soon as one of my clients says, "Well, I want you to show me that your quality management is the same as the ISO 9000," then for me as a firm, it's easier to 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 use this standard and to be certified as an ISO 9000 standard user, you might say. That's my type of quality management in the firm then. So it
Mhm.
is voluntary, but there might be obligatory parts in it later on, either by law or by clients. So I can imagine that at a certain moment, a local government, say in Paris or Ljubljana, Amsterdam or Washington, they say, "We want you to work in compliance with standard," and then they give you the number, that ISO standard. So, for example, we want you to work according to the ISO standard 22341 from 2021. There's always this year with it, and then you have to do it. Then suddenly, as if I want to do some consultancy for the city of Washington, and they ask me to comply with their standard, I have to buy that standard, I have to check it, and I have to understand and say that I work according to that standard.
Mhm.
Normally, you have to make a contract which is that thick, but in this case, the city of Washington can simply say, "Dear Mr. van Soomeren, we want you to comply with ISO standard 22341. Do you comply with it?" And then I can say yes. So instead of a that thick a contract about how to do it and what to do exactly, you simply refer to a number, and that's standardizing the process, you might say then.
Mhm. Yeah, and simplifies it as well, I would say. Yeah. Um, so, Paul, you kind of mentioned already, and let's touch upon this now. I was going to ask later, but you mentioned kind of almost the difference between the standard, the guidelines, the bylaw, the maybe accepted policy. Can we maybe, or building code? Can we maybe just reiterate and very briefly explain the difference between the two and connection potentially?
Yeah,
So what's the difference? Mhm.
yeah. So well, probably we must have more than 1,000 guidelines on septet. Every city or most cities nowadays have their guidelines on if you build something or if you renovate or if you start working in a neighborhood, you have to think about crime prevention. So maybe the name is different. So the guidelines in the Netherlands don't use the name septet, for example, but we have guidelines in several cities. We also have, and then it becomes a real standard because you can buy it with each national standardization institute. Every country has a standardization institute, standardization body. You can go to the website and order standards there. You're on the level of a national standard. And these are, well, and then it becomes rather complicated. You have official standards, you have technical requirement, technical specifications. All these numbering and names are different. But well, that's not so that's not so interesting. So for ISO, you have these standards, and that's well on septet. It's the new one is ISO 22341, issued in 2021. That's the standard, worldwide standard for septet at the moment. So you have all these differences, but the good thing is that you can always refer on a worldwide basis in every language. You can simply say, this is the standard. This is how we work. This is how we define septet. This is our process, and what's in it. That's how we do it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I've been, on several continents, and I could see so many different guidelines, and they are usually contextual specific, and they do actually refer to quite different concepts as well sometimes, right? Some include first generation and second generation, some only refer to first generation. So it is quite interesting how diverse they are. But when you have a standard that they can also refer to, they can ensure that minimum standard is incorporated also in their local guidelines, right? I mean, that's how I would also see it in a way.
Yeah, and it works pretty good because, well, you see in a globalizing world, you see, for example, architects from one country working all around the world for urban planners, but also for often community work. It is the same. So it is important in a globalizing world to have a simple set of guidelines, and we call them standards, you can refer to. Otherwise, it would be awfully difficult, because if I would be, let's assume I'm an architect or an urban planner, and I have to work in another country, then you can give me the guidelines from that country, but it's in the local language. I I don't understand a word of it. So the easy thing about standards is that um, they you can refer to them with one number. You can buy them everywhere, and often they are translated also in local. These are official translations. So, for example, this ISO standard is brand new. That's in English, but normally most standards would have also a French, a German, a Spanish version, or even so. The standards we made in Europe. I noticed there's also a Swedish version. I don't speak a word of Swedish, but I know exactly by referring to the number of that standard that what's in it, because there is an official authorized, as they call it, authorized translation of that standard. So I can read the English version or the Dutch version, and in Sweden they can read the Swedish version, and then you know you use the same number.
Yeah, and then you can tell them, check that section on such and such,
Yeah.
and they're
Okay.
yeah, which is pretty cool.
I think they call it. They don't use the terminology of chapters. They use the terminology of clauses or whatever. So, but that's the standard, the language of standardization. So you can say, okay, let's do the work over here, and I'm referring to clause number 2 from this standard, this number. Okay, then everyone knows what you're up to.
Mm-hmm.
Well, this whole idea of standardization. One example I give on product standards and how it changed the world is the idea of a container. So in the old days, 100 years ago, I live in a harbor city. People were using all kinds of means to transport, and you had to take out the boats, all kinds of different stuff. Now, and using only one standard, you have a standardized box, and we call it a container, and it has hooks on standardized places. So all over the world, you use the same containers. They fit on the boat. They fit in the harbor. They fit on a truck, on a train, and it's only because it is consensus about the measures about this container, the points of where you hook the container up, so to speak. There's a worldwide consensus about a box. That's all there is to it. A consensus about a box, and then you have a worldwide consensus about it, and you can use the same box everywhere in the world on the same in the same manner. That changed the world in some respects. This is on a product, but you have the same on services, and you have the same on processes. The ISO 9000 on quality management, or the 31,000 on risk management. These are standards on processes worldwide. And now we can be proud on ourselves. We also have a CPTED standard, the ISO
Mm-hmm.
22341, issued in 2021. There's
Mm-hmm.
yet another thing. A standard is obligatory. You have to re-edit it every few years. So it is a kind of, when there's a standard, it will be up to date always.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, I mean, it just makes sense, right? It needs to reflect changes in the society and the field and so on. So now this actually fits into this part as well. So I want to make sure that we talk a little bit about how the standards actually came to be, because obviously this didn't happen overnight. I think you told me this was 20 years in the making. It's quite crazy to hear.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I just checked it, and on the European standards, it was a Danish initiative to start that. And CEN, the Comité Européen de Normalisation, the European Standardization Institute, backed that up. And I just checked it. We started that in '95 actually. So, and then after about 8 years, we had the first standard. It goes awfully slow, and the explanation is that, well, the Danish started it, and then later on the Dutch joined it, and the British joined it, but it took a lot of effort to also include the Spaniard, the French people, and more joined the initiative, and then to find consensus between all these completely different people. I remember I chaired that committee, that working group doing it, but only on a word like delinquency, meaning something different in France and the UK and all these languages. We could talk about that for ages, and and then after a while there is a consensus, and you drop that in the text, and then everyone says, okay, now it's officially, we agree to this text. Then there's a very, very formal voting way of voting. So every country in Europe, the bigger the country is, the more votes they have, and then after a while, they call it a formal vote. Then you end up having a European standard. The first European standard we had on CPTED. It has a different name in Europe, but in fact it's CPTED, Crime Prevention Through Environmental Design. The first standard we had in 2003. Then later on, the French and the Italian and people like to make a kind of a manual for it, and they added something, and this became the 2007 version. So then you see first standard 2003, then we learned a lot, second standard 2007, and we are now at this moment as we speak working on a new version of that European standard again. Well, a lot of the ideas from the European standard went to Korea, and Harry Park from Korea did a lot of work, and he is the one under Swedish secretary. They made this ISO standard, but you will recognize a lot of stuff from the European standard in this ISO standard, and I think that's perfect, because together we learn to do it better. What they did in the ISO standard is to add a lot of information about the CPTED, what CPTED is, and the ideas about first and second generation, and references to that. Probably by re-editing now the European standard, we will use these ideas again, and to include that in the new European standard. So standardization goes on forever. That's another good thing. You are actually, as a standardization institute, you are obliged to every once in a while you have to re-edit a standard. So as we speak, we can start with re-editing the ISO standard also, because, well, maybe in using it, we found out that, okay, this part isn't completely correct. We don't like this part. Well, then we can change it, and then there will be maybe in 2030 a new ISO standard. It has the same number, 22341 point 2030. Then that's a new version of the standard. But well, let's use this one first, the 2021
Yeah.
version. So yeah.
Well, with the ever-changing world, and things are changing even at a faster pace now. Yeah, of course. I mean, it's no question. These things will probably need updating even more frequently. So yeah. Okay, cool. Shall we maybe say a few words about the Standardization Committee, which kind of links to what you were saying now, evolution of, the development of the standards, and what kind of role does the ICA Standardization Committee, under your leadership and the leadership of Dr. Tim Pascoe, play? And maybe just to mention the other committee members here, Bo Grunlund is one of the initial instigators as well. Then Randy Atlas, Gregory Seville, Manjari Kapoor, Dr. Macarena Rao as well, Tinus, and myself. So we kind of wanted to make sure that we represent, myself, Matea. So we wanted to make sure that we represent different regions of the world as well, and that we, bring the kind of consensus, we come to the consensus, even though we know it's been so challenging. But I'll let you say more to that, Paul. Thank you.
Yeah, we started this ICA Standardization Committee, I think a few years ago, and we can use it as a kind of a focal point for standardization in general, and certainly for the worldwide standardization. So we already use this Standardization Committee. Tim Pascoe and I and Bo and you, we are from Europe. We are at the moment working on updating that old European standard, which is from CEN 2007. So we use this Standardization Committee as a kind of a mirror group, you might say, bringing in new ideas, commenting on the standard, saying, "Hey, this is a bit outdated. Did you think about this? Maybe you can rephrase this?" So we can use this Standardization Committee and all the knowledge that's there for making and updating a standard. In the future, no doubt, this Standardization Committee can be the focal point for that ISO standard also. So if people say, okay, we worked with this ISO standard, but well, we have ideas about it, how to make it better, how to update it in due time. We as a Standardization Committee of the ICA can play a role in it. So that's important to have a worldwide focal point, and that's how we ended up by having people in from all kinds of continents in this Standardization Committee. So yeah, I think we can now say we are the contact point if you talk about continental or worldwide standardization. Give the ideas to us, and we'll see what we do with it.
Yeah, exactly. And as an international organization, we are in a strategic position to be able to do that, right? And like you said, we're so diverse. We have people from different continents. So yeah. It makes sense. Yeah.
And on the other hand, we can play a role also by dissemination of the knowledge of which standard exists. What's the history of it? What's the content? But these standards are still owned by the Standardization Institute, ISO, International Standardization Organization worldwide, or, for example, CEN in Europe, or You in your own country, there's always a standardization institute, and that standardization institute has a website. You can go to the website, you can talk to these people and connect to the international world of standardization. Standardization product, services, and processes.
Yeah. And I've done that. So waiting for the reply. So yeah, something that I forgot to ask earlier, Paul, was I noticed that sense standards, for example, are in several different parts, right? Even now where kind of terminology is separate from the principles of CPTED, whereas ISO standard is kind of one larger package. So can you maybe just explain rationale behind kind of, having these different type of documents?
Yeah, when we started in Europe, the Danish initiative in '95, I remember that we started with the SEN standard, which we called number 2, which is mainly on the process of CPTED. Then there was also a standard on terminology. I think already when it was issued, that standard wasn't too good. It didn't cover all the terminology. It didn't cover all the definitions, because terminology in a standard in Europe should always be published in the German, the French, and the English language. It didn't cover it. It wasn't perfect. But then we realized, okay, we can update it later on. We're working on that now. As an example, Tim is having the lead. Tim Pesco is having the lead there. But then when we had this first SEN standard, European standard, we realized, okay, there can be a more specific standard only for residential use, for residential neighborhoods. So a second standard was made for dwellings, which is mainly focusing on burglary, because that's the biggest risk for dwellings. And then they started to make a standard on shops and offices, which is it has the same, it always has the same number, but then as a second number to it. Then after shops and offices, there was one on transport facilities. So then it becomes, you might say, a series of standards. So you have one general standard on the terminology and one standard on principles and process, but you have all these subtype of standards for different use in different environments. I think what might happen is that the same will be worked out for the ISO standard, but that's just, I'm not sure about it. So it's a way to proceed. And again, the same goes for the standard for dwellings, for example, is the most interesting for housing association or homeowners or that type of people, while the one on shops and offices is interesting for shop owners. So then you can buy the one standard on terminology, one standard on principles and process, and one on shops if you're a shopkeeper. A lot of these standards are, by the way, people are they have a kind of a contract, and they buy this, they get these standards in a regular basis. When you're an architect, for example, you have all these standards, and you pay a certain price a year, and you have every new standard is always sent to you, so you're automatically updated on all the standards, because it's an enormous amount of standards which are there now.
Yeah, so many rules and regulations for every part of our lives as well, right? So yeah. Okay, Paul, we have covered a lot of ground. So do you have any final thoughts, anything else that we have forgotten maybe to mention or that you would like to emphasize?
I think it's important to include the whole separate community in standardization. I still notice it sounds awfully difficult, standardization, and okay, it is a lot of bureaucracy. It goes slow, but remember what my starting words. It is just a few people around the table wanting to make a tool, a consensus tool for better communication. It is that simple. It's all about communication and consensus. And well, we are all humans, so consensus, finding consensus in our own country, in the whole continent, and worldwide, is awfully difficult, and it takes a while, and that explains why it goes so slow. But I think in the end, consensus and a better communication always works, and the more people are involved in it, the better it is.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well said. I mean, in my research on implementation of CPTED, communication was one of the key important points for successful implementation. So it just makes sense. It makes it so much easier if everyone at the table actually understands what we're talking about and kind of speaks the same professional language. So it definitely makes that communication simpler, I would say. You can avoid some of the snags. Yeah.
Fully agree. Yeah, that's it. Yeah.
Yeah. No, it's great. Thank you so much, Paul. I would just share some information before we say farewell. So those interested in the same standards that we were talking about, please have a look at the European Committee for Standardization. Here is their website in the banner at the bottom. And if you want to look for the CPTED standards, this is the number you look for in the search engine, and you have a series of standards that Paul has mentioned earlier. And if you're interested in the ISO standard, so the International Organization for Standardization, the very fresh, hot, out of the press standard that just came out, check their website on ISO.org and look for this number, or your local standardization body, of course, as Paul has said. Do contact us also if you have any more information. If you want to get in touch either with Paul or ourselves, we'll definitely ensure that we connect you with the right people. Join us if you're not yet a member. And that's it. Thank you so much, Paul, again. Thank you for being here, for taking the time to clarify some of those questions.
Okay, it was a pleasure. Yeah. Thank you, and bye.
Thank you so much. Yeah, bye-bye. Stay safe, and we'll see you soon. So we'll just play a little promo video as an outro. So thank you so much, Paul. Bye-bye.
Bye.